Okay, hi everybody. Let's talk about long-term goal, not long-term goal planning, short-term goal planning. I don't believe we made it to that, and if by some reason I'm misremembering, let's review. Although I think we haven't quite made it to short-term goal planning, so I'm going to review this with you so that in class we can work on actual application, maybe I know we have presentations coming up this week, and we want to do more application. So let's just take a look at long-term goal planning. I'm trying to move this ahead. Here we go. I'm not meaning long-term goal planning. I mean short-term goal planning. What is a short-term goal? Well, obviously, maybe it's kind of obvious that it's a step in the achievement of a specified long-term goal. But just to remind you again that a short-term goal is like a long-term goal. It's a category of behavior that has been identified within developmental linguistic research within a developmental taxonomy. And the short-term goal will come from the developmental taxonomy used to generate the corresponding long-term goal. So the time spent on long-term planning pays off because it really gives us a blueprint, a framework for continuing on at the next planning phase, which is short-term goal planning. And again, like a long-term goal, a short-term goal represents functional linguistic competencies that are expressed in the comprehension and production of language in natural communication contexts. These are the relational things that I have been emphasizing. These stand as short-term goals as they stood for long-term goals. Why? Because we want to be generative in what we accomplish with our clients. What are the critical decisions that we make at the short-term planning phase? And the first is, what are the intermediate functional communication achievements that we see leading to the acquisition of the long-term goal? And there are typically a number of stages or steps that a client will have to go through to get ultimately to the long-term goal. So then we have to ask ourselves which achievements should be prioritized in the short term. That is, which should come first and which should come subsequently. So what information guides us? Well, one more time, that the ASHA facts reminds us that the short-term goal must represent functional communication, and that I'm just reminding you of this point, that functional communication is generative. It's a characteristic of language as a relationship-making property of the mind. I stress this. And developmental taxonomies from developmental research represent an evidence base for goal planning. We are, again, working from an evidence base for intervention planning. And developmental research counts very significantly as a framework for establishing goals of intervention, particularly at the long and short term. Now, the specific sources of information we will use with reference to a specific client are that client's long-term goals and the referent taxonomy, which will give us the components. Again, and a taxonomy does two things, by the way. They give us the components of speech and language that we have an option to target. Once we're selecting a taxonomy, that taxonomy will address aspects of speech and language, keeping in mind, of course, that there are speech and language is a system comprised of, it's a nonlinear behavioral system comprised of subsystems, content, form, and use subsystems. So the referent taxonomy, for example, again, the Bloom and Lahey taxonomy, gives us content categories, syntactic structures, specific ones, by the way, not general ones, not generally syntax or generally content, but specifically the aspects of content to focus on, and content categories in the Bloom and Lahey position. If we were doing Brown semantics, we'd be talking about semantic relations. In any event, in syntax, we got SVC structure from the Bloom and Lahey angle, or conjunction, complementation, and relativization as other syntactic structures. A Chomskyan framework would be a bit different, but similar, overlapping, but still a bit different. And so the taxonomy gives us the components of speech and language to target, that are options for targeting, and the actual developmental sequence of behaviors based on research with typically achieving children. And typical achievement is the foundation for intervention planning, regardless of the disability type. What we also have to pay attention to, we have to address the question, how much can be accomplished over the short term? If we're working with children, I guess that comes shortly, the idea of time frame. But within the time frame that's established for the short-term goal, we have to ask ourselves, what is achievable? Because goals, again, we use the acronym SMART, and that A stands for achievable. So what's achievable for that particular client over the projected short term? Well, maintaining factors, in addition to language and the severity of the language delay or speech delay, the severity and number of maintaining factors gives us a clue as to what the prognosis is, what that client is able to, can be projected to achieve. And remember, again, the maintaining factors are cognition, sensory motor functioning, psychosocial factors, and medical factors. They need to be considered. Two more considerations that give us a sense of what can be accomplished includes client family caretaker commitment to attend. How frequently will the client's family or caretaker of one sort or another, could be a spouse in the case of an adult, a partner, children. What is their ability to participate in the intervention? And what is the time allotted? Here again, if we're working with children, typically it's a term for the short-term goal. If it's with an adult, it's what the insurance company will cover, or the program they're in will cover. And it could be a month. If we're talking a short term, say 6-month intervention, and we're talking monthly short terms, of course that could change. That's variable with reference again to the intervention, to the agency that is supporting the intervention. So let's look at LC again, and look at how long-term, short-term goal planning plays out for LC, the client that we've been following, as we looked at a long-term goal and the procedural approach. So again, we're thinking we have to consider present level of functioning and long-term goals. Well, the long-term goals for LC, remember, is that he will produce embedded and conjoined causal chain narratives and explanatory narratives incorporating procedural and causal relations. And we established additional or subordinate long-term goals that were components of these long-term goals, which included the production and interpretation of figurative language forms, the use and response to verbs and adverbs that signal suppression and reordering of behavior, an executive function goal, and for some reason it's doubled here. Look at that. I said suppression, reordering of behavior, signal suppression, reordering of behavior. I think I repeated myself here. Well, hopefully you get the point. I should have edited. That should have been edited, right? Now, baseline data, we have to consider where is he. Those are the long-term goals, and the question is where what will help guide us in short-term goal planning. In addition to these objectives, would suggest that he has a relatively mild language issue, but he's in context of assessments like the self, which look at executive function or the use of language as a problem-solving device and as a behavior suppressing device and as a behavior directing device. There, the results indicate a moderate to severe delay. A significant difference between expressive and receptive language scores, with the receptive language index greater than the expressive. So metalinguistic and executive linguistic performance in adult-directed contexts are delayed. But as I started out saying, in self-directed conversational contexts, English language production is mildly delayed, and this is a child who is, I believe, bilingual, and does L1 is now English, but he has because he is in a subtractive bilingual environment, is losing the Spanish. So he produces complex content-form interactions, manifest in conjunction and complementation syntax, but not relative clauses. In Spanish, he's producing single verb sentences, and he does produce additive and temporal chain narratives in Spanish and English. So what developmental taxonomies guided long-term goal planning? Well, Lahey story grammar taxonomy is the one that we were focusing on, in which that taxonomy identifies additive chains, temporal chains, and causal chains as a developmental sequence, and within each there are structures that develop. And within the causal chain domain, or level of organization, we have automatic goal-based causal chains with obstacles embedded in conjoined causal chains. Isn't that crazy? I have dogs in the background here. I hope they're not bothering you as you listen to this. I'm going to skip past the Trebasso structure that that will take up a little time here, but if you have a chance, and I can look through the PowerPoint that goes with today's lecture, the short-term goal PowerPoint, you'll see another developmental framework, Trebasso, and that looks at causal relations, development of causal relations, or causal events within causal chain narratives from the Stein and Glenn Lahey angle that propel stories forward. And that's one, too, to keep in mind, that I keep in mind. Now, in the domain of executive functions, Best and Miller, Piaget, and Brown are different, taxonomies that guided this, that provide this kind of developmental taxonomy that executive functions use to inhibit actions, shift procedures given commands, SVC commands, conditional if-then commands, with reference to observable object attributes and states, conditional if-then commands with reference to conservation, I'm kind of making relationships between Piaget's work and some of the work of, again, Best and Miller on the what develops over in the domain of executive functions. Inhibition of actions are again telling oneself to wait, or to wait, or before I do this, do that. So hold back until doing this first thing I'm saying, until you do the second thing, and then come back to the first. And then we're talking about more commands that get more complex. SVC, if-then conditional commands, with reference to observable attributes and states, and in context of conservation tasks, conditional if-then commands become more complex. I also considered, we also have figurative language targets at the long-term level, and they're based on Nippold's taxonomy in her text on later language learning. And she identifies a developmental sequence that involves or includes all becoming able to deal with alternate meanings of lexical items that are semantically based or syntactically based. If you remember, the test of narrative language has items on it such as the elephant was ready to lift. That has two meanings. Lift something and be lifted. One is an active, one is a passive interpretation based on syntax. That's that's developmentally more complex than the woman broke her heel, another item. Heel meaning heel of the shoe, heel meaning heel of her foot. Well, that's a less developmentally complex item. Idioms, transparent to opaque. Similes, metaphors. Similes before metaphors because they're more direct. Metaphors more opaque. And humor as a area of figurative language. So these are with reference to these taxonomies, which were used to begin with, to establish long-term goals. We go back to those taxonomies and ask ourselves, and look at the research and ask ourselves, what are the prerequisite developmental achievements that would lead to the long-term goals we've established, involving causal narratives, both causal chain, which are tend to be fictional, and expository or explanatory narratives, which tend to be instructional. We see that we make a decision to establish the long-term goal will produce temporal chain explanatory narratives containing conjunctions before, after, and until, to direct the clinician in context of a problem-solving task. So he will direct me, if I'm the clinician, using a temporal chain explanatory narrative. He'll tell me, before you do this, do that. After you do this, do that. Don't do this until you do that. And we'll look at, what kinds of problem-solving tasks are we referring to in terms of the context. Well, we'll consider that when we'll address this when we think of, we go to procedure planning. The context really is the procedure, and it begins to be built into the goal statement. Notice the format of the goal statement: the child's name, followed by a observable, measurable behavior, a temporal chain. Explanatory narrative is observable and behavioral. I can look for conjunctions before, after, or until. I can look for the pragmatics of manding or directing the clinician, and I can see whether or not this is happening in context of a problem-solving task. So it fits the bill of observable and measurable. Note that, I think I was asked at the end of the session last time whether we should put criteria here, 8 out of 10 trials, or 2 times and a half in a session. And if you're writing short-term goals for an IEP, you do need to put in the criterion. I usually we'll discuss criterion when we talk about session goals in more detail, and you can apply what we say to short-term goals. Dr. Klein, my colleague and co-author on the books related to intervention planning, felt that at the short-term level we don't need to include the specific criterion, but we would include that at the session level. If you're writing for an IEP, you do need to include them. Another short-term goal. Remember, we're thinking LC is a school-age child, so let me remind everybody that we're thinking about him in terms of a term. So we have him producing a temporal chain narrative. Can he do more? Well, we think yes, he can produce a conditional causal content-form interactions using conjunctions if-then, unless or otherwise, also in a problem-solving task. So we're going to work on temporal, and we think we'll get to conditional causal. And we'll produce similes. One more short-term goal with reference to the subordinate long-term goal, having to do with figurative language. Similes being the most, an early form of figurative language use. We'll produce similes to describe attributes of objects manipulated in context of a problem-solving task. Well, a simile is, this is as little, as big as a house. This is as small as tiny as an ant, or something along those lines. And I think we can facilitate that kind of thing while the client is involved in problem-solving tasks. Again, I'm not going to identify the problem-solving task we're going to target here. And I think we started thinking about this at the long-term phase, and we're going to come back to this again here at the short-term phase as we operationalize procedural approaches, and then at the session phase we'll actually define these problem-solving tasks for particular sessions. So I'm sure you're thinking, I hope you're thinking already, well, what kind of problem-solving tasks would support explanation narratives, explanatory narratives, or if-then interactions, statements. And again, I didn't write for the second one to direct the clinician, but maybe that would have been better to add that. To direct the clinician while engaged, he can both. But I think that I understand why I didn't, because the temporal chain narrative, do this and then that and then that, which tend to be procedural in nature, procedural reference problem-solving procedures, lend themselves to the pragmatics of commanding or directing. But causal statements tend to be more conversational or discourse oriented because they explain things. They explain things. So you're not commanding somebody, but you're explaining something to somebody or to yourself why this has happened, or if then. Now, if then could be used to be, could be used in a command situation. Yeah. Well, I'm looking now at if then unless. Now I'm thinking out loud to you. I'm thinking out loud to you. So on one hand, causal content-form interactions tend to, this happened because of that. If it's a because structure, then that would be a discourse, conversational kind of thing that would not lend itself to commanding, right? Now you could say, well, do this because I say so. So maybe they would. But if then, unless and otherwise can in fact, as I think about this now, can in fact be directive. You see, if this happens, then do that. If taste, if you're doing, again, I'm trying to avoid identifying a specific problem-solving task, hoping that as you watch this, maybe you have some ideas coming into your own minds. But you immediately start thinking of procedures you see as you work, as you write goals. So I can see, if this happens, then do that. That can certainly be a directive kind of thing. Or unless this happens, do this. Otherwise, don't do that. Otherwise, get it? So that does lend itself to directing the clinician. And maybe it would have been a better goal. And I should modify that now and say to direct clinician while engaged in problem-solving tasks. I think I like that better. Be more specific. And then LC will produce similes. That one, it doesn't. It's as big as blah blah blah. That's discourse or conversational. It's a comment. It would not certainly lend itself to direction. So the pragmatics of it plays a role too. And in fact, the question we ask often is what context is obligatory? What context should we create that would obligate the structures that we're teaching? Again, I'm going to go into this in some detail at the session level, particularly under this. We'll have an additional consideration at the session level. Performance demands. What are the demands of the task that we provide the client? Implication of everything I've said: developmental taxonomies identified at the long-term planning phase that describe functional generative linguistic achievements, guide short-term goal planning. Each of these chapters conclude with a chart that you can use in clinic to guide yourself in goal and procedure planning. And so this chapter or this slideshow, this lecture ends with a chart, CAM slip we call it, or MK slip, for deriving short-term goals.